All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I knew this was going to be a popular topic. Looks like we got about 50 on the phone right now. Um, as a couple people may be aware, perfSONAR project is going to hit a major milestone release this year, perfSONAR 5.0. So we wanted to make sure that we had a presentation on this to give everybody a little bit of a preview of what's going to be going on. And Andy Lake and a lot of other members of the perfSONAR development team are here. But Andy will be the primary speaker, so I'll turn it over to Andy to go through the details.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Jason. And yeah, thanks for giving us the time today to talk about this. So yeah, we're pretty excited. So we've been giving presentations on perfSONAR 5.0. I think actually you could probably measure in years at this point, just all the buildup and stuff as we've progressed on things. But this is the first one where we actually have a release date. So April 17th, perfSONAR 5.0 will go live. So that is 2 weeks from Monday, less than 3 weeks away. So pretty soon. So my goal today, not only just to remind you kind of what's in the release and all the good things that are coming with it, is also want people to kind of remind people some of the implications in terms of data migration and things like that, and things you can do between now and 5.0 to kind of get ready for it. Because as Jason mentioned, this is a pretty big milestone release. We don't bump that first number very often. And so, we take these kind of chances. They're sometimes a little bit more disruptive releases in terms of changes and things like that. So we just want to make sure everybody's aware, make sure you can take the right actions to do what you want and get ready for that. And also just to remind people too that we are here to help. Like, really the biggest thing I want to get out of today is have some time at the end for people to ask questions about, various aspects of this, right? And really kind of drive home some of these points. So this is actually the second presentation like this today. Earlier in the day, Jayant also held one that was at a little easier time for our European friends. We'll have more emails going out in the coming weeks to remind people. So this is kind of our PR blitz, as it were. And so glad everybody could join today, because we want to kind of reach out to as many people as possible. So let's take a step back for a second and kind of just talk about the path to perfSONAR. So as I mentioned, we don't bump that major number very often. So perfSONAR 4.0, if you remember, the theme for that release was measurement and enabling kind of new and more types of measurements. So that's when the PScheduler component came into perfSONAR and gave us this really nice plugin architecture that we've been able to leverage kind of ever since. And you'll actually see even in 5.0, we have a whole new slew of plugins coming with this release that people can leverage. It turns out that was exactly 6 years ago. We didn't really do this intentionally. Mark pointed it out to me. Mark Veit from Internet 2 pointed it out to me after we kind of set the date that it was exactly 6 years ago. If we would have been a year earlier, he also pointed out, we would have been at the 5-year anniversary and got 5.0 out. So that would have been fun. But maybe we'll try for something like that when we go up to 6.0. And so perfSONAR, as I mentioned, has been in development for a while. We actually did the first beta last year in May. So we actually have been in beta for almost a year. And so during that time, we've been collecting feedback, making a bunch of changes. And we kind of knew when we did the beta, we wanted to take things slow because, again, we knew it was going to be disruptive. We want to make sure things work really well, give it time to burn in, people to use it. So we've made a ton of changes since then that have kind of, been rolling out as we made them. And so if you've been installing the beta or updating your beta, you've been getting all those changes. And we feel like, we're at a point now where we're comfortable that, we're ready to pull the trigger on the release. And so the biggest change, and what I'll probably spend most of my time talking about, is we're basically taking out the backend storage system called ESnet, where when you run your measurements, the results get placed. And we're replacing it with something called OpenSearch, which is kind of an off-the-shelf open source variant of Elasticsearch. I'll go into a little bit more on what both of those are. But as such, that obviously there's some old data that sits in ESnet. We're going to bring up this new backend, and new data is going to start collecting there. So there's some implications on what happens with that old data, and we'll talk about those in the various scenarios. And so just to zoom in on this so people know, so ESnet, the old archive, If you've ever looked at like the process list or see what's installed, you'll notice there's like this Cassandra database. We have Postgres, which PSchedule also uses Postgres. And then ESnet has this little Python app that sits on top, and basically it keeps some of the data in Postgres, basically the descriptions of the measurements you're running, and then the actual results go in Cassandra, and the Python application kind of munges these two things together. And then it has its own kind of custom REST API that was developed. So why are we replacing ESnet? Well, ESnet was kind of developed quite a while ago. I don't know, maybe going on a decade at this point. And kind of since then, there's a lot of really good kind of off-the-shelf open source options for time series storage that weren't around back then. And they provide really nice query languages. They integrate really well with visualization platforms like Cassandra. And there's just like a lot more support out in the world for using those rather than some custom thing that us as the perfSONAR team have developed, right? And then as ESnet has kind of aged, there's basically lots of old kind of creaky spots that we either need to do like complete rewrites of or do a migration like this. And just the cost benefit was it makes more sense to move to something newer. One great thing, in 4.0, I mentioned kind of the theme was kind of enabling more measurements, and we kind of got that plugin architecture. One of the types of plugins we got was different archiving plugins. So people didn't have to use ESnet if they didn't want to. They could easily ship the results to other backends. And some of our users actually did that. So if you look at like the WLCG, they have like a big Elastic backend that they've supported for a while. Groups like NetSage and internally at ESnet, we have a project called Stardust have also shipped those results to other backends, often kind of Elastic based. So that kind of helped us kind of make the decision on the Elastic variant OpenSearch. And so we really just kind of wanted to build on those successes and kind of really, the theme for 5.0, I think, and this is the first step, I think, on that path is improving kind of visualization and analysis. And so by getting kind of this better storage engine in place, I think we're setting ourselves up for some really nice features kind of going forward. And I'll highlight some of those in action. Okay, so I've mentioned this thing called OpenSearch a few times. This is the new backend that's replacing ESnet. So it's a derivative of Elasticsearch, if you're familiar with that. The reason we're using this as opposed to Elasticsearch directly is, partway through our 5.0 development, Elasticsearch actually changed their license to what's called a server-side public license. It's the same that like Mongo uses and things like that. It's not officially recognized by the USI. It's a fairly open license, but not to get too much into the legal details. Basically it's their way of kind of fending off some of the big cloud providers from selling Elasticsearch without them seeing a piece of profits. You may land on how you feel about that one way or the other. On the perfSONAR project, though, we have lots of installations out there that we don't control. I have a lot of different organizations with different IT departments, different legal departments that all have different views on these things. So we need to be as conservative as possible with what we distribute. So OpenSearch is a Amazon fork of Elastic that has an Apache license, which is a very, the same license that perfSONAR uses for all its stuff. And so we were comfortable going with that as opposed to Elastic directly. If you have an Elasticsearch instance or things like that, all our stuff should actually work with that directly. So you still have that option, but in terms of what people get by default when they run yum install perfSONAR toolkit or apt install perfSONAR toolkit or whatever, that's going to be the OpenSearch variant. So how does this all fit together? So how will your results, you run your measurements, and how will it ultimately get to OpenSearch and then get displayed on the various web interfaces and such that we have? So as I mentioned, PScheduler has this kind of idea of plugins. So one of the plugins it's had even before 5.0 comes out, it's had it for quite a while now, is called the HTTP archiver. So basically, a measurement will run, we'll use this HTTP archiver to send the result over HTTPS to something called Logstash. That'll be installed by default for you. That'll do some formatting and handle some of the basic interactions with the OpenSearch database, where it'll ultimately get stored. So one other piece that's kind of important to highlight, you'll see in this diagram, there's something called Elmend. That's our clever way of naming the backend that speaks the old ESnet API, but can talk to things that look like Elasticsearch. So in this case, OpenSearch. So that means that if you have clients that talk to ESnet currently, like in terms of using the query API, at least doesn't support the write API, but the query API, those will continue to work. So like Mad Dash, for example, uses that, and even the 5.0 will continue to use that, and it'll just kind of work. It won't really know the difference. It'll be issuing what look like ESnet queries. They'll actually hit OpenSearch on the back end, and then come back with the right set of results that look like they were coming out of ESnet, and it won't be able to tell the difference. The cool piece is, so all the old stuff will still work. It also opens up a couple new avenues. So if you're familiar with Grafana, kind of the open source visualization platform, it's really popular. It's kind of multi-data source. You can talk to a lot of different backends. I know from previous presentations like on this call, and just seeing others that probably people on this call have given. It's quite popular within our community. I can talk directly to OpenSearch. There's a standard Grafana plugin for doing that. So it kind of opens up that door possibilities, and I'll actually show that directly here in a moment. There's also something called OpenSearch dashboards, which is basically, if you're familiar with Elastic and Kibana, it's the OpenSearch version of Kibana. All it is just another interface for kind of browsing the data. You can actually also do some OpenSearch kind of database management type functions through that. So really the summary is you get a few more visualization options that you'll be able to play around with. All right, so I've already talked about some of the benefits of upgrading and really focused on that OpenSearch piece. So that opens the doors to lots of neat things, both now and I think going forward as we do 5.1 and 5.2 and so on. But there actually are quite a few other things that are in this release that are probably worth highlighting. So one is we'll finally have Ubuntu 20 support. So I know that, along with many other OSs, has been requested many times by those in the community. We are working on the other OSs. I'll talk about that kind of at the end, where those are on the timeline. So we'll continue to support, EL7, Ubuntu 18, and Debian 10 like we do now. And so Ubuntu 20 will get added to that list, and then we'll be adding more of those in the next coming weeks and months to that officially supported list. There's a bunch of convenience features. These may be more boiled down into power users or people who kind of pay attention, but I'm going to highlight them anyways because I think some people on this call probably fall into that category. If you've ever had to point at a psconfig template and you run that psconfig remote add command, and you've forgotten to do the -- configure archives option and then wondered why your results don't show up, we finally changed the default after the feedback on that. So you don't have to add that -- configure archives. It'll just work and do that by default, which we think will probably save people some headaches, because I think if you've done much with psconfig, you've probably ran into that before and had to do the facepalm and rerun the command with the right option. So hopefully that's easier to do now. And then we're also kind of updating our test point package to include the JSON monitoring service that comes by default with the toolkit. The big reason to highlight this is, one of the larger meshes out there, and I know one of the largest communities that a lot of people participate in, is kind of the WLCG dashboards. They historically have suggested people run the perfSONAR toolkit because they have a bunch of basically monitoring tools they've built that use that monitoring service. So this will open the door if you don't want all the GUIs and you don't really care about local storage and all that stuff. This will open the door for those members to actually run the test point and just use like the central services that the WLCG has. You can still do the old thing. This just kind of makes it nicer if you don't want to do that and still get all the nice monitoring hooks and all that. And then the last thing, there's a couple on this slide anyways, there's a couple toolkit UI improvements. If you've ever used the PSchedule plot command at the CLI, it can generate this nice like image that gives you an idea of how busy your pscheduler schedule is. We've actually integrated that into the toolkit UI, so you can play with that now. And this may seem silly to call out, but we actually have not had a logout button on the toolkit UI until 5.0. So there's no logout button, which I guess is a good thing. And so there was so much stuff I couldn't fit it on one slide. So there's actually a whole bunch of PScheduler plugins as well coming. A few of these I think have been in the pipeline for quite a while. I think we'd forgotten that we hadn't actually officially released these. So you can kind of see the list here. Like, for example, the Wi-Fi BSS ID scan. I think Ed Cologne from Michigan has presented that a couple times. And I know I think he's presented even in this time slot before. So all of that's kind of officially going to be out the door, and you can easily install all that stuff and play around with these, which is always exciting. So before I then kind of get into some of the next steps people need to worry about in terms of kind of getting ready, I did just want to show off one thing that you can do when you have a 5.0 host, and that's related to actually hooking it into Grafana. So, we're giving this big presentation about perfSONAR 5.0 and talking about all the big changes and stuff like this. I think a lot of you, though, I could see, maybe the update, we pushed the update out on April 17th, your toolkit updates, everything I'm assuming is going to go perfect and swimmingly, and, everything will be great, but you'll come to your toolkit and you'll look around and be like, what was the big deal? Why was Andy kind of making such a fuss about all this stuff? It looks basically like the same, like it did before. I get my list of tests and things like that. Like I mentioned, there is this new link down here to plot your PScheduler graph, which is kind of cool. So if you want to see the last couple hours of tests, you can go back a little bit further. You can do stuff like that, but that's pretty minor, right? For bumping a whole version and making such a big deal about it. So this toolkit that I'm running right here, it's just kind of a test toolkit that I have. It's actually just like a little GCP VM. Is actually running OpenSearch in the back end, right? So it's 5.0. So what that means is instead of using just this default view, I can actually install my own Grafana instance. So I just did a standard Grafana install. You can read the Grafana documentation. It's like a yum install Grafana server. Basically, I could point it at that toolkit OpenSearch and start building dashboards like this. So I'll get into what I had to do that, which wasn't very much. So this is just kind of an example dashboard I put together. And so what that gets me is, instead of just like the line graphs that I had, I can use all these kind of cool visualization plugins that Grafana has in there. So like this top one is a timeline plugin it has. You can kind of see where these various loss events are occurring between my little test VMs here. That are all in the same data center, so they're not going very far. And yeah, there is actually quite a bit of loss, which has been interesting for drawing these. You'll also see some things down here that might look familiar to you if you've used Mad Dash before. So there's actually a plugin that we've developed that is an official Grafana plugin. It's called the Matrix. And it basically does exactly what Mad Dash did before. So we can recreate that look here, because that's been I think a successful visualization for us. But one cool thing about Grafana is we now have a lot more control over it. So you'll see, basically I've just issued a query to OpenSearch. I'm just grabbing the latency BG test, so the OAMP test. I'm kind of building a source. The source and des are my rows and columns. That's those there. I'm looking at max packet loss. Now, if I wanted to say change that to average, I can just edit the query here and do that. I can edit the look and feel too. If you've been bugged by the boxes being too small or anything like that, I can bump those up here and apply that change, and we get some nice big boxes. So we have a lot more control. You also don't have to use like host names and things like that to build the rows and columns. Like I said, these are kind of boring because they're all in the same data center, but if you're in different locations, you could use, there's some location information stored with the results now. So you can maybe do country to country, or city to city, or things like that, org to org. So you have a lot more options here. And I think what we're really excited about is to see kind of what the community comes up with now that they have the ability to do these types of things much easier. So yeah, I think that's probably what I'm most excited about with 5.0 coming out. And it's even worth noting too, we can do similar things as before. You can kind of click through. I don't want to say my changes that I just made, and get all your normal line graphs that you'd had as well. And again, you have similar control over those and can kind of look at things. Can even grab trace routes. And again, I think there's probably some really cool options here for what people can do. So I showed you what you can get. So how did I get this, right? So as I mentioned, I installed the Grafana, and then really all I had to do was make sure I had the right couple plugins installed. So you can manage your plugins from Grafana. It comes with kind of a default set, and then they have kind of a this interface for finding additional ones that are like official Grafana plugins. So OpenSearch is one of those. So you can search for OpenSearch, grab that. I've already installed it, but there's an install button if I hadn't, and that would pull that in. And I mentioned too the Matrix panel that I showed that looks like Mad Dash. That's also an official one. So you just install that, You can do that all through this UI. No special magic you need to make that happen. Just a typical Grafana install, and you'll go here, and this will show up. And then I basically just need to point Grafana at OpenSearch. So I do that in the data sources here. You'll see I already have this one set up, so you didn't have to watch me type. But basically that toolkit that I was looking at before I jumped over here, you see that's the IP. Basically just pointing at /OpenSearch on that. It's got a self-signed cert, so I had to check this. If you set up Let's Encrypt or have a proper cert, you wouldn't even need that. And then basically just pointed out the table name, and it can read from PScheduler, and the PScheduler table is essentially an OpenSearch, and we can build all that stuff I was showing, and that's really all there is to it. So the plan is to basically have some cookbooks for how to do this by 5.0, so people can kind of start playing around with this. If you do yum install perfSONAR toolkit, we're not pulling in Grafana or anything like that yet. One thing we want to look at doing in 5.1 and kind of beyond is streamlining that process for people. But for 5.0, you'll have the back end, and then you'll have the ability to do this and start playing around. So I think that'll be really exciting to kind of see. All right, so that's the fun stuff in terms of features and all that. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty though, in terms of preparing, getting ready, what's going to happen to old data, and some things like that. So I think the biggest question and the biggest thing we want to highlight here is, so what's going to happen with old data? So if you remember, perfSONAR has a bunch of different bundles, and depending on which one you install, you get kind of a certain subset of the software, right? So TestPoint is our most basic. Well, actually there's a tools, but TestPoint's usually the one that people use. It's got PScheduler. It can run, regular scheduled tests, but it doesn't store anything locally. It ships it off someplace else, right? So good news, that's an easy one. You don't have any data locally. You didn't have ESnet on that host before. You're not going to have OpenSearch on it now, so you don't really need to do anything for that particular host. Where things get more interesting though is as you kind of move through our bundles. So the Toolkit, which is our most popular bundle, and I'm basing, based on what I see in like our lookup service and things like that, I'm guessing what most of you probably run, is our Toolkit. So it's going to be auto-updated to 5.0, but it's really important to highlight your data will not be migrated to OpenSearch from ESnet. So I'm going to zoom in on exactly kind of what that means and what you're losing there. It won't get deleted off a disk. It'll still be on disk, and we have some options for kind of moving that to a standalone ESnet instance if you really need to get at that for a while, and things like that. But that's kind of the first thing to highlight. Then the second, or I guess third, scenario listed here is if you have a central archive, right? So maybe you have lots of little test points writing to that. Maybe they're different orgs, maybe they're all in your org. And so you've probably installed that doing a yum install or apt-get install ESnet, or the perfSONAR central management package if you've installed that. So for that, we want to give people a little bit more flexibility when they do the update. So it won't be auto-updated. And the way that works is, you've installed ESnet or perfSONAR or central management. There's actually not new 5.0 versions of those, so they'll just sit tight. And your clients can continue writing to you, whether those, test points or whatever they are have upgraded or not. The ESnet archive plugin is not going away. They'll still just write to you like they would before. And you can kind of control that upgrade process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. Okay, so let's zoom in on the Toolkit case. So just to set a little bit of context here in terms of, I mentioned the data is not going to get migrated to OpenSearch. So ESnet, kind of since its inception many, many years ago, has aged out the data after 6 months. So we're really talking about kind of a 6-month window of the data. As I said, it will not be deleted off a disk, so it'll still be on there. It'll kind of be in cold storage mode, I guess you could think of it. And so, as we kind of have been, when we initially started talking about 5.0, and I mean, this has kind of been our plan from the get-go, was we just didn't think it was probably feasible for the average toolkit to be able to handle the migration process. So basically, it would require running ESnet and OpenSearch at the same time, both of which can be a little bit memory intensive, and the toolkit itself is, I think a lot of them out there are probably under what we recommend already. So having them run both in parallel, we thought a lot of bad things could happen there, in addition to having support the kind of migration process. And we just kind of thought it wouldn't work well for most people and probably cause more headaches than it's worth, especially when we're considering not a huge window of data. Now we understand you may need to get to that data. I was actually not too long before this call, even running through the instructions one more time of how to migrate this stuff to no host. It's really not too difficult. It's basically some SCPs and some yum installs of Esmond, and it kind of just works. So we will provide some instructions for copying your old Esmond data over to a new host that just runs kind of a standalone Esmond, and it's pretty easy to point with the graphs just by manipulating the URLs and things like that. To look at those. So that data will be there, if you really need to look at it. And after 6 months, it would have been gone anyway. So you're going to be back to square one, not too long after you upgrade. People do have the option, if you're not comfortable with this, or want more time to think about it or whatever, you can disable auto updates. So in the email I sent out on Wednesday, there's a link to instructions how to do that. We've had instructions on our docs.perfSONAR.net for a really long time on how to do that, just in case people want to. So you can disable auto updates and then have more time to figure this out if this is something you're not comfortable with. But we do encourage everybody to update, because we do think kind of the benefits outweigh kind of the short-term pain this may not cause for you with the auto update. And so then the other case I mentioned is the central Esmond instance. So you have just kind of Esmond running by itself on a host. So this one, like I said, it's not going to auto update, which means when April 17th rolls around, if you're still not quite sure what you're going to do about kind of the whole upgrade process, that's okay. Everything should still keep working. I know probably what we could see a lot of people doing is maybe running Esmond and OpenSearch in parallel for a time. So you might have your old Esmond host, then you might have a separate host where you do a yum install, perfSONAR archive, which will set everything up nicely for you. And then you can update your PS config file basically to write to both that your clients are looking at. We would imagine being a typical case, and then move Esmond out of commission, and whatever timeline you kind of come up with. So that's kind of the basic idea. And I may be wrong, but I'm kind of guessing this might be where people have the most questions. So when we get to the end, feel free to grill me with that if I can clarify, because I know there's a lot of caveats there and different scenarios, and I know every site is slightly different. So this is another place where I want to emphasize, even beyond today, we as the perfSONAR development team are here to help and kind of help you get through the various scenarios and working through your particular instance if need be. So all right, so that's all the archive stuff. There are a couple other things I want to highlight that are also important to take a look at. So this particular one, I think there's so much focus on the archives. I don't want this one to get lost in the shuffle either. So there is a change to the PSchedule limits. I can't remember exactly which version of 4, but there was a deprecated limit type called the test type limit. And so it's officially going to be dropped, no longer just deprecated, but completely dropped from support when 5.0 comes out. If you're using the default toolkit limits file, like you haven't touched your limits file, then there's really nothing to do. It'll automatically upgrade. You're good to go. No worries. If you haven't made any manual changes to your limits file, though, then you'll need to take a look and see if you have any of these. And if you do, you'll need to manually update them. This is something you can do before 5.0. You can do after this call. We do have a script that's linked to here and is also in my email that went out Wednesday for help, basically for checking those. There's some instructions in the README there. Basically it's just a little bash script, I believe, that will take a look. If you're all checked out, it'll tell you you're okay. If it sees any of the old types, it'll let you know that, kind of let you know which of the limits are the old type and things like that. I think there's some instructions maybe in the README or guidance for how to migrate those. Usually it's making them into a JQ limit. Again, this is an area where, feel free to hit the user list or, and we can help you, figure out how to migrate those. We didn't want to write something that just like forcibly auto updated those, because our worry was, if you've made that change, you're obviously trying to limit some type of thing. And if we got that wrong for whatever reason, then basically you could have the potential to get tests that you didn't want to allow in the first place. And we figured it was safer just to, call out, basically have PSchedule not running rather than having you get slammed with UDP tests or something horrible, that you didn't intend for. So we wanted to give kind of people we wanted to make sure a human was involved to check these things out, basically. But hopefully most of you, it won't affect, just it'll kind of auto update, or you don't have these in there. But if you do, there's the script to check that, and we encourage everyone, even if you're not sure, just maybe double check that you're okay there. So one other thing too is 5.0 will be the first release we do where we're not going to do an ISO image. So, basically, I think a lot of users do it this way anyways. You can basically just install your operating system of choice, using whatever method you prefer these days. And then once you do that, do the apt or DNF or yum or whatever, install perfSONAR Toolkit. Basically, our reasoning for this being a major upgrade, we thought this was probably a good time to pull the plug. It's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of maintain the ISO. Part of the challenge is the boot environment that you are running in when you're installing all the packages is slightly different from when you are, already have a working operating system. There's basically some special care and feeding we have to do to make everything work in that environment. And also kind of the ISO tools are starting to, I don't know, they don't seem to be updated very often for building that. So we kind of get the impression that, the perfSONAR packages have evolved enough that really it's just as easy to just do the straight package install. There used to be a time when, there was all this prep work that was required to turn off SE Linux and things like that. And that's just not the case anymore. You bring up a vanilla, CentOS host or Ubuntu host or whatever, and then you just run the OS package manager, and things kind of just work these days. So so that's where we've kind of landed on that one. So that's just one other thing to highlight. And then just a couple other things worth mentioning is in terms of packaging, the perfSONAR Central Management package has been retired. So as a refresher, this installed Esmond and Mad Dash together on the same host. If you want to accomplish the same thing, you can actually just install the new perfSONAR archive package, which sets up all the OpenSearch stuff for you. And just do if you do a yum install perfSONAR-archive and Mad Dash, it's actually less characters than typing out that full perfSONAR Central Management, and you'll get the same thing. So we just kind of got rid of that single package for doing that. And then there's also a new optional package called perfSONAR Dashboards, which will install the Kibana equivalent that I mentioned earlier, just for browsing the data and managing OpenSearch. That'll be available as well. So a few package things there. All right, so I went through all those details. Let's break it down. What can I actually do between now and April 17th? So I think one easy thing is check your PSchedule limits file for that change that I mentioned to see if it affects you. Use that script. So that's probably, that is definitely the easiest way, just to double check. Then review the data strategy and kind of what we're planning to do. If you're good with the toolkit data, just kind of sitting on disk and, kind of pressing the reset button on some of those graphs, then you can just sit back and kind of let auto updates happen and you're good. If you're not, then, you can either disable auto updates, or if you just want to start getting stuff ready to migrate your Esmond data, you can do that, or even just mentally preparing. Yeah, there's that. If you want to get a little bit more hands-on with 5.0, our beta is still out there. I would not recommend installing it on prod host, just that way it's it's basically stable at this point, but that way you just don't, a lot of times when people do that, they forget to not stop pointing at our staging repo after it goes to prod, and then they end up getting future betas. So it's probably still best to kind of keep those things separate. But yeah, we encourage you to kind of play around with that and see how that works for you. And then again, I know I sound like a broken record on this, but remember, we're here to help. If you have questions, we know this is a big change. Every scenario is slightly different. We'll do our best to help you out. And then kind of the last thing, just to throw here in the last bit, if you're just bored and want to look at some cool new stuff, we actually have just recently launched a stats.perfsonar.net. So this has a bunch of the lookup service stats. This is actually also a Grafana-based interface, and pointed at the lookup service. So encourage people to poke around that. Kind of the idea is this will eventually replace that service directory page, if you've looked at that ever, that kind of shows where the perfSONAR installs are. So yeah, so this is kind of cool. I'll give you some new options there. So that's just kind of a fun thing you can poke around at between now and April 17th. All right, so then let's look after April 17th a little bit. I mentioned that additional operating systems are not too far after 5.0. We just didn't want to necessarily block on all of these, and we didn't schedule these for the April 17th release, but we're not going to be too far after that. So kind of our goal is by early summer, like June timeframe, maybe even some of these a little bit sooner than that. We're looking at adding support for Alma 8 and Alma 9. And in our experience, if you have a different Red Hat variant that you prefer, like Rocky, they seem to just work. So, you can substitute Rocky in there or whatever. We've just said in previous ones that kind of 8 and 9 are what we kind of target most of our builds on. We'll also add Ubuntu 22 and Debian 11 because we were kind of behind on those. And so those should be coming sooner rather than later. We were actually pretty far along on most of these. And as far as the development team goes, we just need to, there's various corners for each of them we need to kind of clean up. And so hopefully should be able to get those out pretty soon. And then looking beyond the summer, like I said, 5.0 is kind of really, I think, the first step in then setting up a lot of really cool features. So we really want to look at kind of building on some of the Grafana visualization and streamlining that for people, and maybe even looking to replace Mad Dash with something more based on that, because that's also something that's gotten getting a little long in the tooth as far as the code goes. And I think there's some nice options for doing that. I should probably give a taste of that when I should, like the grid plugin and stuff like that. There's some other stuff coming too in the pipeline. So while not just solely a perfSONAR change, because iPerf 3 extends, I think, beyond just perfSONAR, there's a threaded version of iPerf 3. I was just talking to Bruce Mai yesterday, the iPerf 3 developer. Sounds like a public beta is like sooner rather than later. So that's kind of exciting. Likewise, we're looking at kind of re-architecting the PowString command. So this is what runs your latency tests in the background. Threading that as well. Basically, this is a resource efficiency. If you run a lot of PowStreams, you may have noticed like the load on your host is really long just because of all the bazillion of processes it generates. We're basically trying to, resolve that, issue. And then we've got we still got a lot of Perl bits in perfSONAR if you pay attention to the codes. So we're slowly kind of working on, well, not slowly, but we're working on kind of getting rid of the last bits of those and converting to Python. So psconfig is one of those pieces that we're making Python. That's actually relatively far along. At Geonth, they've been developing kind of this analysis tool that looks at kind of micro changes and latency and things like that. So we're looking at integrating that in the future. And then this one's probably a little bit further out, but the psconfig web admin interface, we're in kind of early design phases for redoing that, and we'd like to integrate that more closely with the toolkit and stuff like that. So that'll be stuff coming down the pipe. All right, so summary, and then we can get into questions. April 17th, 5.0 is coming. The toolkit data, not going to be migrated to OpenSearch by default, will still be on disk. You have some options for getting out that data if you really need to. Centralizement instance, you can start thinking about how you want to upgrade. There's nothing you may absolutely have to do by April 17th. Things should keep working, but kind of be aware. And, we would ultimately like everyone to get off of Esmond if they can. And check your PSchedule limits file, as I mentioned a few times. And then, we've got a lot of exciting stuff kind of coming after April 17th. And once again, we are here to help you. All right. So that's all I've got. And I've saved about 20 minutes for questions. I could even hang around a little bit longer, which is good. And I see there's some stuff in chat, so I can poke around those.
Yeah, so I'll read the first one since it's already been answered. Does OpenSearch archive package include the dashboard package also, or would that need to be added to the install list if you wanted to do central archiving? And Shimon said that the perfSONAR dashboard package will be optional. And then the open question from Phil is, would it be possible to dump and transfer Esmond content into OpenSearch in order to allow longer timeline view in Grafana?
Yeah, so no, we can't dump the data into Esmond. Basically for the reasons I mentioned, we don't have a process for doing that. We just didn't think the cost outweighed the benefits of doing so, which we know is maybe one of the more controversial changes for this. But yeah, so unfortunately the answer to that question is no.
Okay. Well, while we wait for more questions, either use the hand feature and you can just speak your question if that's easier for you, or type it in. I have just sort of a couple. Since this is sort of a major release for the project here, I guess because I always like to feel around the edges of these things. In your testing so far, when you were just sort of looking at upgrades and things like that, were there any major things that you encountered that you knew were going to be problems, or do we expect that the procedure that you laid out is going to be pretty straightforward?
Yeah, so it should be pretty straightforward. I mean, we've been doing a ton of upgrades. I probably within the last 2 hours actually just did another upgrade of a host. Just playing around with it, and at least in our testing, again, we always run into weird scenarios once it gets out there in the wild. It's been really straightforward. You got your 4.0 host. When you hit yum update, it finishes the process, and obviously the old data is not showing up in your graphs anymore, but your tests just pick right back up where they left off. Your graphs fill in, things seem to be working, and all of that. Also been going through a lot through the transfer process. I was actually just doing some touching up to the document that talks about how to move the old ESnet data to like a new host so you can look at it and point at things. That seems to be going pretty straightforward. I think we have all the caveats in that document, at least that we've encountered. I mean, I'm sure others will encounter more and we will work through them. But on the surface, at least right now, it's looking pretty good. So.
Okay. Andy has another one. Do you expect to have a beta period for the EL 8 and 9 packages, or do you think you will just release the GA packages?
We will probably do I would guess we'd probably do a beta. It'll probably be a much shorter one. Well, it will be a much shorter one than this. We might just do like a couple weeks or something and let people know those are available to try out. So I'd imagine we'd probably do a short one. I don't think I said this, but not that it really matters. Probably when we do those, like there's not going to necessarily be like a perfSONAR version bump. Like, if we're still up, 5.0. whatever we're on at the point when we release those is what those will be called. We're just kind of planning to roll those out as they're ready. And I know we have a lot of eager people probably wanting to test some of those, just again based on questions we've got. So we will share when those are ready, and then it's always great if people can help. So.
Okay. So while we wait for more questions or hands to go up, I got two more. Have the major sort of adopters of perfSONAR, I'm mostly looking at us, ESnet perspective or the Internet 2 and JM perspective, have we upgraded all of our backbone nodes yet to the latest release, or are those still going to stay in the older versions until burn-in period is done?
Yeah, so on the ESnet side, I can talk about a little bit what we did. So our setup, basically the way we work these days is we have a bunch of test points, and then we write to a central archive. We actually have run a big Elasticsearch cluster, not just for perfSONAR, for all our stuff. So we've been using the Logstash pipeline piece of this for quite a while that then writes into our cluster. And you can actually have 4.0 stuff do that because, like I said, it has the HTTP archiver. So in terms of testing the storage part and how well that works, we've actually been doing that for a while. In terms of the individual test points, those are still on the latest version of 4, I think 4.4.6, and run the Docker container. We will update when everybody else updates those. We do have like a test host. I've been talking to some of our infrastructure people. We're actually testing out some of our hosts, and we're actually really excited about the Ubuntu 20 piece because we right now run Docker containers on Ubuntu 20 hosts because we didn't have another option, which I don't know if I highlighted that. So that is a good option while you wait for some of these OSs, is you can run the Docker container in the interim. So we are going to be we're testing those out right now, and I've obviously been doing tons of installs. We've been working really closely with the LHC folks. So in particular, if you look at like the Open Science Grid or WLCG dashboards, there's one of the CERN hosts that's in there. That's a pretty busy host. It's actually been upgraded to 5.0 for a little while. Sean McKee and Marion Babbitt were nice enough to kind of update that host. And that since it's busier, it was actually really helpful for some load testing to make sure. What's really nice about that host is if you look at it in those dashboards, you can't really tell the difference. It looks like every other host in that dashboard. It's got results. You click on it, you get graphs and all that, and it seems to be working pretty well. So And then I can't really speak to Jayon and Internet 2. I mean, they're all development partners. We've been doing tons of internal testing. I don't know about the prod deployments, but I imagine they're probably in a similar spot in terms of maybe doing some testing on the side. But generally, we all, I think, wait for the do the the entire update when everybody else does. So
Okay. And then I still don't see any others, so I'll ask again if anybody does have questions, either type or raise your hand. I can ask my last one. And maybe you said this, but what's going to be the trajectory for EOLing perfSONAR 4?
yeah, so usually what we do is 6 months after the release of the next version is when we kind of end of life that. I don't know that we've talked about, like, for example, the ESnet plugin and PScheduler. It's possible we'll keep that in there a little bit longer so people can kind of write to it still. We will stop doing updates to ESnet and things like that after that point. So like if there's big security things that come in, like after 6 months, we're not addressing those anymore. So we do really encourage people to kind of in that 6 month time frame move over if they can. Yeah, so yeah, great question, and thanks. I did not explicitly highlight that, but that is an important bit. So yeah, if you get moved over, please do that sooner rather than later. And Mark, go ahead if you have some things to add.
Oh yeah, hold on, Mark. Let me give you the power. All right, go ahead, Mark.
All right, I have the power and it feels good. So yeah, just to kind of add on to what Andy said about the like the ESnet archiver and stuff like that. There is nothing technical that prevents us from extending its life if we need to. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about our deployment at Internet 2 and our POPs, and also an internal design thing in PScheduler that's probably worth mentioning as well. So Internet 2 we have a big beefy system in each of our POPs that's got a lot of cores and a lot of memory and a dual 100 gig Ethernet card on it. And we actually run currently we run one kind of virtual perfSONAR node in a container that's just sort of bound using the Mac VLAN feature of Docker directly to one of the 100 gig interfaces. We have some plans for the other one that people will probably find interesting, and we'll probably talk about those later. One of the other big changes, and this is an entirely under the hood change that probably no one will notice, is that the innards of PScheduler have been, or part of the innards, I guess, have been overhauled to make better use of having more cores on a system. One of the things that we've discovered recently, and this again is thanks to WLCG and the immense load that they put on these things, is that we basically kind of bumped into Python has this thing called the global interpreter lock that basically makes any Python program single threaded whether you want it or not. So we've done some things to take care of spreading that work out among the cores so that if you have a big system, you should be able to do more with it.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks for the updates, Mark. And Andy also pointed out in the chat room, unless you have extended support for CentOS 7, that's going to EOL by June 30th, 2024 anyway. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Andy.
Yep, excellent point. So, and why we're trying to get some of these extra OSs out as soon as possible, because we need people I know people need to make that migration anyways. So
yeah. And I haven't looked at the old LS report in a while, but are you still seeing a lot of pre-perfSONAR 4s out there, or
I was actually
rid of them?
Thinking about that. I don't think pre-4s. What I think 4.0 we did on CentOS 6, but I think it EOL'd between 4.0 and 4.1. So you see a lot of 4.0 hosts that are CentOS 6 still. Well, a fair amount of them, more than probably you'd like to see. So that, I think that's the biggest old straggler that we have. So yeah, our hope is some of those, I don't know how many of those are like in the big LHC meshes and things like that, but part of this is, there's some data challenges and things coming up in that community over the next few months. And so there's a big upgrade push going out soon. So we're trying to have everything nice and ready for that. So hopefully that'll quash at least a few of those. But yeah, that's really I think most of the 3.x ones have died away. I'm sure they're out there somewhere. But yeah, the 4.0 specific, on CentOS 6 is kind of the new variant of that. So
Okay. Yeah, and that's public service announcement to all of you. If any of you changed jobs and you left a perfSONAR node and didn't tell anybody about it, please tell somebody about it so that it could be removed from the world.
I don't know how long CentOS 6 has been EOL, but it's been quite a while now. So
Yeah, probably years. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that we may be at the end here, so I'll thank Andy and Mark and the rest of the perfSONAR development team for giving this presentation. You know, as everybody on this call knows, you know, this is a critical piece of our research infrastructure. So please keep the questions coming to the perfSONAR user list or the Slack channel or whatever your preferred method is, and hopefully we'll get a nice smooth upgrade and we won't have any problems and we don't have to have Andy back on to yell at him that it went badly.
Thanks, Jason.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We're on a 1-week pause because of the holiday next week. And then we're going to be having a talk on microburst activity the week after. And I'll send out some info on that after the holiday. So hope everybody has a good break and we'll talk to people soon.